So hello and thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Alin Suciu and I am the convener of the online lecture series Material and Written Culture of Christian Egypt, which is organized once a month under the auspices of the digital edition of the Coptic-Sahidic Old Testament project and the Seminar for Egyptology and Coptic Studies at the University of Göttingen. I'm broadcasting from Helsinki, and I am so glad to present Louise Blanke, who is lecturer in late antique archaeology at the University of Edinburgh. Louise obtained her PhD from the University of Copenhagen and held prestigious postdoctoral positions at the University of Oxford and Cambridge. She is a trained field archaeologist specialized in the late antique and early Islamic periods. She participated in different excavations in Egypt, Jordan, and Qatar. The reason why I invited Louise to give a paper in our lecture series is her recently published monograph, which I find wonderful, a book based on her extensive fieldwork experience as a member of the Yale's monastic archaeology project at the White Monastery and Atripe. The book is entitled An Archaeology of Egyptian Monasticism, Settlement, Economy, and Daily Life at the White Monastery Federation, and it appeared in 2019 as part of Yale Egyptological publication series. To many of us, the White Monastery, or the Monastery of Shenoute, is particularly known as a home of the largest Christian library in Egypt, estimated by some scholars to about 1,000 manuscripts. As a Coptologist, as many of you are well aware, the White Monastery codices were unfortunately dismembered, and they are scattered today in collections all over the world. As the library of the White Monastery probably possessed copies of most ecclesiastical works attested in Coptic, the codicological reconstruction of these manuscripts is, at least to a certain extent, of course, coterminous with the reconstruction of Coptic literature. Those of us who are interested in Coptic literature and manuscripts have thus been waiting for a long time for a detailed archaeological report on the excavations that we know that have been carried out over the last couple of decades at the White Monastery. Louise's book fills precisely this gap, as it offers a survey of the archaeological remains of the White Monastery Federation, which included in late antiquity and early Islamic period, not only the famous White Monastery, but also the Red Monastery and the monastery for female ascetics, which was situated a little bit further south in the town of Atripe. What I really liked about this book is that it is not simply an archaeological record of these sites, but it rather proposes a reconstruction of the longue durée of these sites from the 5th century until today. So Louise's approach gives priority to the long-term historical development of these monastic settlements and tries to piece together the longue durée, as I said, of their history from many different sources. When the archaeological evidence is blurry, as it often happens, she uses complementary sources, like we are fortunate to possess for the White Monastery complementary sources, like the literary works of Shenoute and Besa, the information supplied by the surviving colophons of the White Monastery manuscripts, hagiographical and papyrological resources, and so on. I will not tell you more about the book because Louise is here with us today precisely to present us a brief outline of the results of her research. So without further ado, I will give her the floor. So please, Louise.
Thank you very much, Alin, for this introduction. And also thank you very much for inviting me to your seminar. And also thanks to the audience for showing up to listen to me speak today. So the title of my talk and also the title of my book is An Archaeology of Egyptian Monasticism, Settlement, Economy and Daily Life at the White Monastery Federation. It is the revised version of my PhD thesis, which builds on years of archaeological fieldwork. I participated, as Alin mentioned, in Yale University's examination of the White Monastery from 2005 to 2012, and I also carried out a survey of the archaeological remains at the Red Monastery in 2011. And during the next 30 minutes or so, I will present a summary of my book and also highlight my main conclusions. The study of Egyptian monasticism has long been dominated by information obtained from the textual sources. The manuscripts, books, papyri, and ostraca are preserved in abundance in Egypt's warm and dry desert climate and have been retrieved from monastic libraries through excavation or purchase at the antiquity market for libraries, museums, and for private collections. Now, these sources comprise monastic rules, letters, saint lives, liturgical texts, and also documentary sources. And together they provide an invaluable source of information. And to some extent, they form the basis for the scholarly view on life in Egypt's monasteries. The archaeological remains, on the other hand, were until recently seen as being somewhat secondary to the textual sources, and with few exceptions, most past archaeological studies have had a limited focus on church architecture or on identifying building types that were thought to be characteristic of monasticism. However, many textual sources were written with an agenda, were selectively copied through the centuries based on specific religious criteria, and only rarely do they tell us about the monastery's built environment, about the physical facilities that framed monastic life and shaped the actions of its inhabitants. The aim of my book was to rectify the situation, and through a careful study of the archaeological remains of the 3 monastic communities that form the White Monastery Federation, I was hoping to reconstruct a more holistic understanding of monastic life and to write a biography of the White Monastery, drawing on all available sources. I'll start by placing the White Monastery in time and space. The White Monastery is located halfway between Cairo and Aswan, some 5 kilometers east of the modern city of Suciu, across the river from Akhmim, also known as Panopolis. It was founded in the 4th century by a monk from a Pachomian monastery, and it became famous as a pillar of Coptic Christianity during the rule of its 3rd abbot, Shenoute, who presided over the community from 385 until his death in the middle of the 5th century. Shenoute was, as an industrial writer of Coptic literature, a zealous anti-pagan and also an instrumental figure in the flourishing of the monastic movement. Shenoute's monastery was the leading partner of 3 federated foundations that included a smaller male congregation known as a Red Monastery and a monastery for female monastics in the village of Thribe, some 5 kilometers south of the White Monastery. During Shenoute's rule, the White Monastery was transformed into one of the most prosperous and influential monastic foundations in Egypt. Shenoute's legacy includes an extensive corpus of writings that were copied continuously through the centuries by scribes at the White Monastery. The several thousand pages that have survived to the present day offer unique insight into monastic life and organization in the formative years of Egyptian monasticism. The textual sources from the centuries that followed Shenoute's death are surprisingly scarce in comparison, and they provide little information until the 17th century, when European travelers began to make their way to Egypt. And for this reason, scholarly attention has, with some exceptions, focused on Shenoute and on the early life of the White Monastery. As I will show in the next 30 minutes or so, the physical remains of the White Monastery Federation offer an entirely different data set. The archaeological record, dating mostly to the post-Shenoute era, consists of a complex built environment that was formed by continuous use for the centuries. As such, the archaeological remains not only offer evidence that supplement and challenge the textual sources, they also provide an independent trajectory to study the monasticism at the White Monastery, a separate storyline through which we can examine the monastery's organization, its development, and its economic foundations. So on this basis, I formulated a few research questions to guide my studies that culminated in my book. And first of all, what is the relationship between the archaeological and the textual sources pertinent to the White Monastery? And secondly, how did the White Monastery develop after Shenoute's leadership, and what processes caused its abandonment? And thirdly, what were the economic circumstances of the White Monastery Federation, and how did the monasteries interact with contemporary society? To address these questions, I analyzed the source material at two different levels. I carried out a micro study of the White Monastery, and then a wider study in which I included the two other congregations within the monastic federation, while also placing these monasteries within the context of their neighboring district of Akhmim, and I cited comparative examples from monasteries throughout Egypt. I examined the monasteries according to the analytical categories of settlement, economy, and daily life, where settlement refers to the organization of the built environment and its infrastructure, economy refers to the production and consumption of food and material goods, while daily life refers to the quotidian activities undertaken by monastics living within the built environment. The chronological focus of my study was mainly on the period between the 5th and the 8th centuries, although I examined the White Monastery from its beginning until the present day. My book is divided into 5 chapters with an introduction and conclusion, where chapter 1 provides an overview of Egyptian monasticism. Chapters 2 to 4 are dedicated to this micro-level analysis of the White Monastery, and chapter 5 explores the White Monastery Federation. I set up chapter 1 to frame the inquiry. It provides a contextualizing overview of the development of monasticism, as well as some of the many different forms that ascetic life could take. The aim of this part of the chapter was to position the White Monastery Federation within the broader context of Cenobitism, which I'm sure as you all know is a communal form of monastic existence that was confined within a walled settlement, guided by an all-powerful abbot and sustained by communal worship, shared meals, a rigid work schedule, and written rules covering every aspect of monastic life. And the monastic rules governing the White Monastery have been expertly studied and published by Bentley Layson, who has identified more than 500 different rules. Following the contextualization, the chapter looks to the local monastic geography by exploring the monasteries of Akhmim or Panopolis. Although textual evidence informs us that Panopolis was home to numerous monastic communities, including Pachomian foundations, the quantity and quality of evidence relating to the monasteries of Akhmim is remarkably low compared to the Federation on the west side of the Nile. Most monasteries have not been excavated, and it is only the churches that have been studied in some detail. There's almost no material available to date the foundations, and in most cases, their chronological origins had to be determined on a basis of architectural comparison or local oral history. The scarcity of sources means that it's not possible to address the organization of the built environment, the monastery's economic foundations, or their development through time. 17 monasteries have been identified by Peter Grossman and by Sheila McNally to the north, south, and east of Akmim, stretching over an area of 18 kilometers. The chronology of these sites appears to have been roughly equivalent to that of the White Monastery, with a primary phase in the 5th to the 7th or 8th century, renewed activity in the 13th century, and some evidence for activity during the Ottoman period. In the final part of chapter 1, I discuss individual structures that were commonly found in the monasteries thematically. And these include enclosure walls, keeps, churches, cells, dormitories, refectories, kitchens, storerooms, latrines and baths, guest houses and infirmaries, scriptoria and other workshops, and monastic gardens. Some of these building types have traditionally been perceived as integral to monasticism, and they've been a focus of much past archaeological research, while other buildings such as latrines and workshops were a necessary component of any community, but they're very often overlooked by both archaeologists and by textual scholars. The chapter 2, entitled Framing the White Monastery, History, Historiography and Archaeology, is the first of 3 chapters in which I deal specifically with the White Monastery complex. It combines textual sources with historiography and archaeology, as I just said, in order to examine the scholarly exploration of the White Monastery, and it attempts to reconstruct a history of the site. The sources include writings by Christian and Muslim authors, especially the extensive holdings of the White Monastery Library, inscriptions found within the church, travelers' accounts, photographic material, and archaeological remains. Most of the sources, however, they derive from the time of Shenoute and his immediate successor. The sources from the period from the 6th to the 16th century, they are sporadic and they refer only to individuals or to activities that relate to the church. But through circumstantial references to monastic leaders, we learn that the White Monastery was in continuous use in the centuries following Suciu's death, and inscriptions from the church show that it underwent a major restorative work in the 13th century. Colophons from the monastic library suggest that books were produced well into the medieval period, but in the 15th century, the White Monastery is described by the Arab historian Al-Makrisi as being in ruins with only the church still standing. And hereafter, it looks like most activities were confined to the church itself. Indeed, the European travelers, they describe the church as having been transformed into a village. And this is a situation that persisted until the monastery was restored in the 20th century. The final part of my chapter 2 revisits the first 2 archaeological missions to the White Monastery, which were carried out by Flinders Petrie in 1907, and then by the local department of the Supreme Council of Antiquities, the SCA, which began their examinations in the 1980s. And then this part of the chapter summarizes the most significant of their discoveries based on reports and diaries from these projects. The excavations that were undertaken by the SCA form the basis of the work that was carried out by the White Monastery project since 2005, which was firstly directed by Elizabeth Bowman and Alin Hedstrom, and then by Yale Monastic Archaeological Project, directed since 2008 by Stephen Davis. Chapter 3, the Archaeology of the White Monastery, presents the work that I did as a member of these projects and reconstructs the chronology of the site based on its architectural stratigraphy. Since 2005, the main focus has been on the areas that have already been excavated and left uncovered by the SCA. Only a small number of new keyhole excavations have been carried out. So between the 1980s and 2011, SCA uncovered some 19,000 square meters divided between 6 distinct areas, and the largest of these takes up some 100 by 100 meters. The White Monastery project carried out excavations in 3 further areas. So this chapter 3, is the most technical chapter in my work, and is probably the chapter that I would recommend that non-archaeologists skip lightly over. It describes in some detail the methodology that was used to examine the archaeological remains of the monastery. To analyze the archaeological remains, each area was examined with particular attention paid to facing, internal relationships of walls and features, and to the usage of each area. So architectural remains, they provided the bulk of this material, while ceramic finds were used for dating purposes as well as to suggest different types of local usage. The ceramic assemblage was studied by Gillian Pike. Now, I just want to talk you through very briefly the map on the right-hand side, so you know what you're looking at. I don't know whether you can see my cursor moving. Yes, you can. Excellent. So if you follow my cursor, then the outlines you see here, that's the walls of the modern monastery. This area towards the left of the map, that is a combination of the cemetery that's used by local Christian villages and by the monastery, along with workshops and modern monastic buildings. To the south, we have a separate gate here that leads to the private quarters of the monks in the modern monastery. On the right-hand side, the large building that you see, oops, sorry about that, is the church. And then these areas that are marked in a dark green are the areas that were excavated by the Supreme Council of Antiquities. So you get an impression of where they're located in relation to the modern monastery. And on the right-hand side, you just see the outline of the Nile Delta, the beginning of the fertile Nile Valley. Sorry, not Delta, the Nile Valley, of course. Now, to give you a taste of the layout of the White Monastery, the area immediately to the west of the church is by far the best understood when it comes to both facing and use. The area is organized around a large open square with similar buildings at the east and western ends that could have served as storage facilities, or I've made the proposal that one of them was the monastic administration. A well and extensive water installations lie to the north, and an enclosure with several internal components is found immediately to the east. The well is associated with an elaborate system of pipelines, revealing that water was distributed in all directions throughout the complex. A thoroughfare runs north-south along the eastern edge of the large enclosure and is met by a long hall, marked in yellow here. The rooms to the north of the hall contain areas of food storage and production, and 3 crushing basins provide clear evidence for oil production. The rooms to the south, the rooms to the south of the hall served as a kitchen with no less than 8 ovens and boilers that were used to prepare the daily meals for the inhabitants of the monastery. The food was consumed in the adjacent refectory, while a nearby building with 2 underground cooling chambers is very likely to have provided further storage for edible produce. So my examinations of this and the other parts of the monastery reveal that it developed through several phases of use, abandonment, and reuse. Although my attempts to define sequential development across the White Monastery encountered difficulties caused by the lack of stratigraphic continuity and datable finds, it was nevertheless possible to detect some general trends. And altogether, I have suggested that the monastery developed over 6 main phases. In the final sections of chapter 3, I discuss the process of the White Monastery's development and abandonment in relation to some of the major historical events that took place in Egypt from the 7th to the 15th century. And I'll summarize these along with the monastery's main phases towards the end of my talk. Chapter 4 combines the textual and archaeological sources in an analysis of the White Monastery's built environment and the economic activities that were carried out at site. The category of settlement was applied to discuss the size of the monastery, its infrastructure, and the total monastic population which the system could support. The second half of the chapter discusses the monastic economy and especially the production of goods and the consumption of food and material culture. My research suggests that the settlement reached its largest extent between the 5th and the 8th century, at which point the White Monastery complex occupied some 75,000 square meters. A testament to the great wealth of the monastery was the discovery of 2 early 7th century gold coin hoards, comprising a total of 800 solidi that were found in this area immediately to the west of the church. One hoard was found in a ceramic jar in or near the monastic administrative buildings, and the other was found near the refectory. To give you an idea of the wealth represented in these hoards, a 6th century papyrus tells us that a new house with a garden plot and bakery near Aswan could be purchased for the sum of 8 solidi, and here we have 100 times that amount. So in the early medieval period, the White Monastery circumstances began to change. The monastery was gradually reduced in size until in the 14th century, it comprised only the church, while the surrounding landscape was in ruins. The archaeological remains suggest that the heyday of the White Monastery lasted up to the 7th or 8th century, and that building activities continued into the 9th century, although on a reduced scale. A good indicator of the monastery's gradual transformation or decline in size can be seen in the changing use of land just outside the monastic walls, which comprised a graveyard and areas for the disposal of rubbish. So in late antiquity, the graveyard was located at the northwestern edge of the monastic complex, but in the 9th century, it had spread into the built-up area inside the monastic walls. And the final pre-modern use of the site saw the graveyard located immediately to the north of the church, which now contained the entire monastic community. A similar development is seen as a movement of middens, which gradually moved in on the monastery, being located firstly just to the south of the enclosure wall in the 9th century at the northern end of the monastic complex until the area immediately south of the church was used as a rubbish dump. So this gradual reduction in size corresponds with a gradual decline in the quality of the building materials. So from the 8th century onwards, mud bricks were used in place of the more expensive limestone and fire bricks, which could significantly have lowered the cost of construction. Another important aim of this chapter was to document the infrastructure, such as thoroughfares, alleys, and water supply, in order to support an analysis of the organizational development of the monastic space and an attempt to estimate the total population which the site could sustain. That was a bit too soon. The literary sources, they present a traditional view of, or maybe it wasn't, of, sorry about that, of monastic economy, which suggests that artisanal craftsmanship such as weaving, rope making, and basketry was some of the main sources of income for Egypt's monasteries. Now, these assumptions have been challenged through recent work on documentary sources from other monasteries in Egypt, while archaeological remains from the White Monastery, they do indeed suggest that large parts of the site were dedicated to manufacturing. The production of oil and bread is particularly evident in the archaeological record, while pottery, textiles, and books were also produced on site. Although the size of the built environment, the choice altogether, the size of the built environment, the choice of construction material, the extensive production, as well as a large coin hoards found on site, bear witness to a wealthy establishment with large landholdings and with access to extensive trading networks. Moving away from the White Monastery itself, Chapter 5 examined the two other communities within the White Monastery Federation, the Red Monastery and the Tripe. The male congregation, commonly known as the Red Monastery, is located some 5 kilometers to the north of the White Monastery. The settlement was smaller, around 45,000 square meters, and was, according to textual sources, financially dependent on the White Monastery. The archaeological site takes up some 10,000 square meters, of which about half has been excavated by the SCA. The main architectural features comprise a church, which was built in the 5th century, but thoroughly remodeled in the 13th century, a well with extensive associated pipelines, a kitchen area with several bread ovens, possibly a granary, and sections of the monastery's enclosure wall. The female congregation in the village of Tripe was located some 5 kilometers to the south of the White Monastery. Here, the main archaeological remains include a church, dye shops, a well, a pillared hall, a structure with a central hallway that may have served as a dormitory, and a refectory. A total of 6,000 square meters have been excavated so far. Of particular importance for our understanding of the women's monastery are 7 circular benches that were found within the refectory. So from Shenoute's writings, we know that all female monastics shared a meal together once a day in the refectory. So assuming that the monastery contained only one refectory and that this refectory was spacious enough to seat all the female monastics, it's possible to suggest a maximum capacity for the monastery. Measuring 50 meters by 10 meters, the refectory could have contained between 35 and 40 benches if they were evenly distributed throughout the room. Following a rule of Shenoute's that states that monastics always should keep a distance of about 45 centimeters from each other, I allocated just under a meter, about 85 centimeters per person, and this would allow around 250 monastics to eat at the refectory at the same time. So transferring this calculation to the structure, which has been interpreted as a refectory in the White Monastery, suggests that a maximum capacity of 600 monastics could have been seated together. In my conclusion, I revisit my 3 main research questions addressing the relationship between the archaeological and the textual sources, the development of the White Monastery after Shenoute, and its economic and social foundation. The archaeological assessment of the White Monastery and its federation has allowed me to evaluate, to supplement, and in some cases, challenge some of the information that's provided in the textual sources. So in particular, my investigation has led me to question the number of monastics said to have lived in the 3 monasteries. Several scholars before me have questioned the claim made in the Arabic version of the Life of Shenoute that 2,200 monks and 1,800 nuns lived in the Federation. But it's only through a careful study of the water supply system, with the food production, and through the refectory size that it has been possible to suggest an alternative estimate of this population, which according to my calculations, as I mentioned a moment ago, would have amounted to a maximum of 600 monastics in the White Monastery and around 250 in Atribe. I have also questioned some texts ascribed to Shenoute, in particular the statement that the White Monastery baked bread only once a year and supplied the whole monastic federation. Now, considering that bread was a main food staple, I suggested that if the 600 monks at the White Monastery on average consumed 2 loaves of bread per day, the bread required to feed the White Monastery alone would amount to 450,000, almost 500,000 loaves per year. So looking at the oven types used at the monastery and more generally in ancient Egypt, it would have taken 10 ovens 18 days to produce such quantities, assuming they operated for 24 hours per day. And additionally, such practice would pose an enormous strain on the monastery's storage capacity, as well as on the supply of raw material. My analysis of the textual and archaeological records suggests that the White Monastery remained in use from its foundation in the 4th century until today, thereby constituting one of the longest lived traditions of Christian monastic life. The archaeological evidence has revealed that the monastery reaches largest extent between the 5th and the 8th century, measuring some 75,000 square meters. And by comparison, the monastery at nearby Balaisa and at Deolan Bahatra and Aswan, they each occupied some 15,000 square meters, while the excavated parts of the monastery of St. Jeremiah's occupied about 32,000 square meters. So as such, the White Monastery was among the largest of Egypt's walled monasteries and is only dwarfed in size by Whit, which occupies an impressive 400,000 square meters of intramural space. The earliest sections of the monastery, they were constructed from mud bricks, and during the monastery's heyday, new buildings were built of high quality fired bricks with limestone, lime mortar and plaster, or limestone floors, while the mud brick structures were replaced by buildings of fire bricks. The evidence of extensive building activity with expensive materials is a really good indicator of the monastery's economic vitality, as well as its importance in contemporary society. it's very likely that parts of the monastery were financed by donors, as was the case with the White Monastery Church. The further development of the monastery bears clear evidence of cycles of gradual decline during which the monastery shrank in size and gradually utilized cheaper building materials. So in the final phase of use, building materials were gathered from within the site itself to be used in the construction of minor structures that were used to house livestock by a community that was living inside the protective walls of the church. There's not one single explanation which can account for the decline of the White Monastery. Instead, many interlinked socio-economical factors were at play. And my studies have suggested that the gradual abandonment of the White Monastery was associated with the continuous pressure put upon Christian communities in the early Islamic period. During the Umayyad and the Abbasid periods, both the land tax and the poll tax placed a heavy burden on Egypt's monastic communities. At first, monks were exempted from the poll tax, but this changed around 705, if we believe the history of the Patriarchs of Alexandria, when all Christians, including monks, were obliged to pay an annual tax. Since the monks of the White Monastery were not entitled to own private property, the monastic authorities would have been liable to pay that tax. And this would likely entail a huge annual expenditure. And it's possible that the whole construction of the White Monastery was in part a response to this new financial situation. At the same time, the slow decrease in Egypt's Christian population due to conversion would have influenced the monasteries. So fewer Christians meant less monastic influence in contemporary society, which in turn would have affected the patronage of the monasteries and their income. And my research suggests that the increased focus on pilgrimage in the early Islamic period, which we see in monasteries throughout Egypt, was developed to maintain influence and revenue for the churches and monasteries. So pilgrimage and visitation was accommodated in the physical layout of the monasteries of, for example, Diyarbakir and also Archaeology, while the medieval textual sources inform us that visitation also became important at the White Monastery. The textual sources suggest that warfare also greatly influenced the monasteries. During the Ayyubid invasion in the 12th century, extensive land holdings were confiscated throughout Egypt, and at the White Monastery, while colophons and books from the White Monastery library, they bear witness to the theft of manuscripts. However, the extensive alterations made to the Church of the White and the Red monasteries in the 13th century suggest that at this point, the monasteries were still in use and at least retained sufficient status to attract Christian donors. The Black Death in the 14th century and the cyclical waves of plague that followed devastated Egypt and its economy, although the details of its impact on the White monasteries are unknown. Now, finally, in the 15th century, the White Monastery grounds were described as being in ruins by the Arab historian al-Makrisi, but an inscription from the 16th century found within the church suggests some continuing activity, as do the reports of European travelers who saw the church transformed into a village, a situation that persisted until the re-inauguration of the monastery in the 1990s. As I've already mentioned, the hagiographical literature paints a picture of monastics who lived alone in poverty and occupied themselves with the production of rope and baskets for meditative purposes and only secondarily for the aim of generating income. And such texts have influenced the scholarly view on monasticism to an extent where basketry and rope making, by some scholars, has been seen as the main income for the communities. However, a closer look of the textual and archaeological sources reveal a very different reality. Johannes Leipold, he suggested that the White Monastery possessed land holdings amounting to some 50 square kilometers, much of which would have been dedicated to agriculture production, either by the monastery itself or leased to tenant farmers. Furthermore, the textual sources, they report on trade in monastic products such as linen and books, which were sold or traded in return for raw materials such as grain or wool. Linen production is attested through the dye shops in the monastery of Erthribe, while book production is confirmed through the colophons of manuscripts which identify the White Monastery as a place of origin. As noted already, the archaeological remains further reveal that bread was produced at all three monasteries, most likely for local consumption. Oil was produced in the White and the Red monasteries, where a total of 8 crushing basins have been found. A large part of the oil would have been consumed within the monastery, but the production could certainly also have supplied a local market. The spiritual aspects of monastic economy are also significant, and products produced and blessed within the monastery would hold a value that cannot be quantified through studies of the products themselves or the mode of their production. Funerals, baptisms, blessings, and prayers should also be perceived as a commodity which generates an indirect payment through donations and sustained the monasteries through hardship. Now, this type of spiritual economy became increasingly more important as Egypt's monasteries gradually lost their productive capacities. On a final note, although wonderful work has already been done by scholars such as MWCCCE and Jean Gasco and many others on the monastic economies, I strongly believe that the material culture of monasteries can add a significant additional dimension to our studies. I like to think that, I hope that I've demonstrated that micro-studies of the archaeological remains of monastic sites are a worthwhile pursuit. Not only can we learn about the layout and organization of the monastic landscape, but the building materials and the longevity of the structures become an index of the monastery's economic health, as well as a good starting point for studying craftsmanship, procurement of materials, networks of trade and exchange. Thank you very much for your attention.